Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Accelerating the Adoption to ePayments. My name is Jennifer Cannell, Senior Director of Brand Management at SunGard's Avant-Garde, and I'll be taking care of a few housekeeping items before we begin. To ensure the quality of today's presentation, all phone lines are muted. However, we would like this webinar to be as interactive as possible, and we'll answer questions at the end of the session. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time during the presentation by typing your question into the Q&A box located at the bottom right-hand of your screen. We have a great speaker lineup today with experts from Masco Corporation, Win Wholesale, and MasterCard. And I'm going to turn the call over to Matthew Dragas, VP of Product for our Payment Services Solution at SunGard Avant-Garde, and he is going to introduce the panel.
Thank you, Jen, and thanks to everyone who's joined us today. Our webinar today is going to be a panel discussion with practitioners sharing their experiences moving from paper to electronic payments, and I think that you'll find it very interesting. So I'm Matthew Dragas. I head up product management at Avant-Garde Payment Services, which produces the PayNet Exchange integrated payments platform used by some of our panelists today. One last housekeeping item. If the slides are a little bit too small, in the lower left-hand corner of the WebEx page, there's a control that you can use to adjust the size of the slides so you can view them just right. So let me start by introducing our panelists. First, we have Marcel Santiz from Masco Corporation.
Good afternoon. Just to introduce myself, I am a 21-year veteran of Treasury. I've been with Masco Corporation for the last 18 years, and I'm responsible for our global Treasury operations. Masco is probably not familiar to you, but we are an $8 billion company providing goods for the home and home construction. You would know us under our names of Delta Faucet and Behr Paint, KraftMaid, and Merillat Cabinetry, and that list goes on. We have a very strong focus in our department on both efficiency as well as systems integration, and we put most of our efforts towards software towards those goals.
Thanks, Marcel. Next we have James Dunleavy from Win Wholesale.
Hi everyone, my name is James Dunleavy and I am with Win Wholesale. We are a leading supplier of domestic and industrial supplies and materials throughout the country. We are a $2.5 billion company, and my role is I started out in information technology as a programmer analyst and developed a lot of our accounts payable solutions. I've been within Wholesale for 15 years, and then I took over our accounts payable department about a year ago for 8 months.
All right. Thanks, James. And last we have Gary Rice from MasterCard.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Matthew. Gary Rice. I sit in a position with MasterCard in the U.S. Market Development Team, focused on commercial acceptance and growing that particular vertical for MasterCard. I manage our supplier enablement program, which over the past year has added better than $1.2 billion worth of new commercial payments from over 6,000 businesses, and focused on that for MasterCard as one of the chief roles and responsibilities of my position. I've been a member of the payments industry for close to 20 years, most of that focused on the commercial sector, and have experience in both the acquiring as well as the issuing side. Glad to be with you today.
All right, and thank you all of you for joining us. So I'd like to start with a brief poll regarding payment execution. How many of you who are on the webinar today are currently printing and mailing your checks in-house? How many of you have migrated your vendors or some of your vendors to electronic payments? How many of you have outsourced some or all of your check printing to a third party? And how many of you have outsourced the entire payment execution, both paper and electronic, to a third party? So we'll give folks a minute or so to respond, and then we'll display the results of that online. And I believe you can check more than one item, so if more than one applies to you, feel free to check more than one option. Okay, and it looks like maybe, Jen, is the poll ended?
Yep, and I'm going to share the results. Just see it in a few seconds.
Okay, so interesting. We see about a quarter of our respondents are still printing checks in-house. Relatively small number migrated to electronic payments, but surprisingly, a large. Oh no, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the no answer. Okay, so we had some people who didn't participate. Looks like nobody has outsourced check printing to a third party, and about 6% of the respondents have outsourced all of their payment execution. So that's good feedback, and just gives us a little bit of an idea of you know, what our attendees are involved with today. So it really raises the question, what's driving the migration to electronic payments? And there's been a slow but steady movement away from checks to B2B payments. 10 years ago, about 80% of B2B payments were made by check. Today, it's down to about 50%, and I think most everyone has some awareness of the hard and soft costs associated with check payments, right? Printers, printer maintenance, supplies, labor, postage, escheatment, as well as the costs associated with fraud. And checks continue to have the highest potential for fraud, I think simply because there are so many points in the payment process where someone can touch the check. But while paper checks persist, what's interesting is that interbank processing and clearing of these checks is virtually all electronic today. Most checks are either cleared by an electronic image exchange or converted to an ACH payment. And actually, increasingly, fewer checks even enter the banking system as paper. Some recent studies showed that about 1 in 6 checks are deposited by account holders as an electronic image rather than paper. Right? Think about the mobile deposit that's available to a lot of us using our mobile phones and are provided by our banking you know, our financial institutions. So really the irony of the whole ecosystem is that check payments begin life in an electronic form in an AP system. They're often delivered to the recipient in an electronic form after going through lockbox processing. They're cleared in an electronic format through the Fed, and so they really exist in paper form simply for transport. And I think everyone's ultimate goal is straight-through processing, right, where an AR department can receive payment and post it automatically without any human intervention. We're not there yet, certainly, but electronic payments help move us in that direction. So let me go to our panel and start with you, James. What were some of the drivers that led you to migrate to electronic payments?
Really, there was 2 major factors for us. It was around automating a process and reducing the cost of just the little transactions. So we had an old line printer that we were doing our own check runs 5 times a month, and it would take, you know, an old printer. We would have to store the paper check stock, had to store that in a safe. We had, you know, a person that had to do it. We had our network operations team that would have to fix and maintain the printer, and our president and CEO at the time just said, this is not what we do. We're not a print shop. So we went looking for an opportunity to automate the process, make it electronic, and that was about 11 years ago, and we opened it up and started working with different companies and found SunGuard, and it really just completely eliminated all of that maintenance, and we were able to take those people and that were handling that and actually turn them into more to better tasks. And also it allowed us to open up some vendor enrollment, so we didn't have to have someone contacting for ACH payment types and things like that. So we could really utilize the staff at SunGuard to help us with that process. So we reduced our costs and we automated the process to make it a lot easier.
Great, thanks, James. Marcel, what were some of the drivers at Masco?
Well, we actually started the process back in 2006 to try to convert our checks over to ACH, and discovered that we just didn't have the wherewithal to do that. We have decentralized payables. At the time, we had about 23 different companies underneath underneath our home office, and each one of them was cutting their own checks independently. And only 5 of those companies had been able to convert to ACH on their own. They were the only ones that had the resources to do so. So in 2007, because we're in the housing market naturally, we dropped from $13 billion a year to $8 billion a year, which only constrained those resources even more. And along in there, SunGard introduced us to this product, and we viewed that as a way to potentially bring those two sides together and achieve the efficiencies we were looking for. At the time, we weren't looking for a virtual card. That was an extra part of the product that we hadn't anticipated. So initially, we were looking to avoid fraud by going to ACH. Then we changed tack a little bit and decided to look really at the efficiency aspect of it, because all of our AP departments had been reduced, and staffing overall had been reduced. We had dropped from about 60,000 employees worldwide to 30,000. So we had issues with escheatment as well. And those were the primary things we were looking at to try to make more efficient processes, and we just couldn't manage it internally. So the SunGard product allowed us to essentially bring some SunGard folks on to do that heavy lifting for us and achieve those rebates as well as the efficiency.
Great, great, thank you. Why is the migration to electronic payments, easier said than done? Because really, at first glance, it looks pretty straightforward. The math is simple, right? Moving to electronic payments reduces costs or eliminates costs. But the real key and the real cost is how you make the leap into them. And there are some significant obstacles to starting and managing over the long term new payment processes. So we'll take a look at a couple of these hurdles and discuss how you can overcome them. The key to successful migration to electronic payments is vendor enrollment. I mean, that's such an important statement. It bears repeating that the key to successful migration is vendor enrollment. And vendor enrollment, quite honestly, is a very time-consuming and labor-intensive and ongoing task. And the first big challenge is that you need staff to call and send letters and send emails and do it over and over and over. Our experiences at SunGard is that the phone is the best way to enroll a vendor, but it takes time to actually get an answer. Your staff would need to invest a substantial amount of time to have a successful initiative. And of course, this says nothing about the maintenance and servicing of vendors as bank accounts change and as payment preferences change. I've yet to talk to anyone from an AP department that's overstaffed. And in a time where we're all asked to do more with less. Our experience has been that most internal vendor enrollment initiatives start with the best of intentions, but eventually they succumb to more pressing projects. And the second big challenge around vendor enrollment is simply contact data. We found that many of our customers do not have accurate contact data for calling into the AR departments of their suppliers. And yes, of course, the company is going to have it for their most strategic vendors, but not for all of their vendors. And imagine you have thousands of vendors, or even just hundreds of vendors, right? It's a very time-consuming process to do the research, to find out who to contact, to talk about enrolling for electronic payments at that supplier. So the real heavy lifting in the process is the actual enrollment. And really, no matter what partner you choose, their success at enrollment campaign should be a key decision point for you. And truth be told, many of your vendors like receiving check payments. Why? Well, because the remittance information is delivered with the payment. They don't have to search elsewhere for it. We all know vendors love their paper, and there are a lot of them who just like receiving that paper check. Even if you are successful at collecting banking details from your suppliers, you're going to find that banking information can become stale. And by that I mean that suppliers change their bank accounts and may forget to notify you. About 10% of vendors will change their banks within a year, and 20% will change remittance locations. And so finding and maintaining and updating and securing the bank information for your suppliers really takes a dedicated team. But I think at the end of the day, vendors really want choices, right? When presented with options, some will choose paper, some will choose ACH or wire, and others will choose card. And actually, some vendors may choose all three within a given year, or they may vary by location. You may find that some of your vendors will accept a card in one location, but will insist on a check at another location. So there's no hard and fast rule that dictates the payment preferences even for a particular vendor. So running a campaign that offers seemingly divergent payment options, you'll actually increase your overall electronic adoption. But the key is to have one team, right, a single contact who can provide all the relevant options to your population of suppliers. Interestingly enough, a recent study showed that as many as 1/3 of the respondents will prefer a virtual card to ACH because they do not want to share their banking information, right? There's a perception out there that their merchant account is more secure than their banking account. And so they'll happily pay the interchange because it means they don't have to share their banking information with anybody else. Interestingly enough, as a technology provider, in the last 2 years, we've seen more payers who do not want to store their suppliers' banking information in their AP systems because of the potential liability if they were to experience a data breach. And lastly, every business has established some sort of process around the issuance of checks, right? They've established controls around separation of duties and multiple signatures, and maybe even controlling exactly when checks go out in the mail. And I think when looking at an electronic alternative, there's a concern that somehow electronic payments will lack comparable controls. So coming back to our panelists, Marcel, maybe you can talk about some of the challenges that you faced internally when trying to make this migration away from paper checks.
Certainly. Primarily, we face some very big concerns about vendor relationships, particularly as it related to the terms that they were paid on. A few years ago, we went through a change in our terms that pushed our vendors out pretty far, and so those relationships were top of mind. Some other questions that we got were whether they needed to worry about PCI compliance when it came to virtual cards. When it came to enrolling vendors, how was the campaign run and what approach would be taken? Did they have control over that so that they wouldn't have to risk offending any clients? Obviously, the biggest question is why would somebody take a virtual card? Not grasping necessarily why that would be desirable for a vendor. Obviously, an ACH is simple, but understanding why somebody would choose to take a virtual card is a more complicated question. We get questions also about signatures on payments. A lot of our companies have rules where over a certain dollar amount, a check requires 2 wet signatures, and SunGuard did a fantastic job of handling that through electronic approvals, and we even have a situation where there are 2 signers required on those an item like that, and they're using the payment release workflow that worked right out of the gate as soon as it was developed. So they were very pleased with that functionality.
Mm-hmm. And James, I know you've mentioned to us in the past that I think you didn't have a lot of hurdles because you had some project champions right from the beginning. But maybe you could talk about the process that you had to go through to get the project moving forward.
Yeah, it was something that we wanted to do. We knew we wanted to do it, so the hurdles weren't really there. But one of the concerns was similar to what Marcel mentioned, was our vendor relationships and someone else, potentially contacting our vendors. So when the vendor enrollment piece, at least of the migration came around, we wanted to make sure that we had a consistent communication to our vendors. So we definitely spent a lot of time working through that. But as far as hurdles, it was just a matter of determining the ROI, understanding what migrating to an e-payment meant, and just working with the teams to understand, there's a real opportunity here to eliminate some of the cost and the things we want to do. And we were doing, I mentioned before, 5 times a month check runs, and we wanted to go to daily. And, it had to go electronic to be able to scale that. And it just, to find the ROI and understand all the aspects of what e-payments means and all the options that are out there with it.
Mm-hmm. Gary, from your perspective, being a member of obviously one of the major card networks, what sort of hurdles have you seen among corporations?
I think both James had hit on it earlier, is there needs to be alignment internally within the organization, because you have procurement officials that have existing contracts with vendors that state one set of terms, and obviously finance comes in with a different mindset, whereby some of the efficiencies that they're trying to take advantage of perhaps upset those contractual arrangements with vendors. So in many cases, one of those hurdles becomes not only moving the payment from its previous method, whether that was check, ACH, or wire, into an electronic form of payment with virtual card, but I think there needs to be an understanding that the extension of a benefit to the supplier on the receiving end of that needs to happen. So in order to build that back in, perhaps language within an existing agreement needs to be amended, sometimes working within legal departments to arrange for that amended language before the campaign has begun. And then obviously extending that benefit to the supplier or vendor that you're trying to change payment to is certainly one hurdle that can be overcome with finding an agreeable payment term, and in some cases that means a more expeditious payment.
Right. Thank you. So generally speaking, we find that initiating an electronic payments project is hindered because of one of the following 4 reasons. Either there's a lack of IT resources, there's a lack of a project champion to drive the project, the project may be in competition with other automation initiatives for resources, or there just may be some difficulty around building the business case and demonstrating the return on investment. So Marcel, back to you. How did you go about getting buy-in, across all the various business units that make up Masco?
Well, for us, it really boils down to convincing them that they're going to gain enough efficiency that the IT requirement can be justified. And they're generally very concerned about that IT requirement, so we really have to explain to them why it's very, very minimal. And it may be fairly unique to us, but we have, for some reason, a very high sensitivity to IT resources. We certainly are short in IT resources. So doing that, convincing that we're not asking for a lot of their IT time to get this done, and yet the return on it is significant for the business unit. That's really the biggest step for them. That, as well as I mentioned earlier, the fact that they're familiar with ACH, but a virtual card's new to them, and they're not clear from the get-go why a vendor would accept a virtual card over an ACH or a check. We certainly have gotten their attention with the rebate levels and as well as the efficiencies they can gain in their staff. So I think as long as they can continue to increase vendor acceptance, the virtual card, especially, and we're able to demonstrate how some of the larger vendors are also accepting virtual card, as well as some of the vendors that take card as a day in, day out part of their business, and were easier hits than expected even. And then the other thing we have to do is discuss with them about the actual campaign and the fact that they have control over how that campaign is run on their behalf. and they can be as forceful or as gentle as they want to be, and they can choose to offer ACH as a backstop to somebody who says no to a virtual card or not. So that flexibility is open to them to run it the way that they want to.
Mm-hmm. And James, you've talked about some of the people aspect of it, right? That there's always some folks who are resistant because it's change, or they may be fearful about what it means for them in their current role. How much of that was a factor at Win Wholesale?
Well, like some of us have mentioned before, our AP department is always stretched. We don't have too many people, so taking a mundane task and allowing someone who is good at it and can get us benefits to actually handle that part of it for us just allowed us to, we didn't let anybody go due to it. It just allowed us to refocus them on tightening up some of our other processes and realizing more of our benefits. So once we started laying out the ROI, kind of took in some of the soft costs, knowing we're not going to be eliminating people, we're going to be working on different strategies. We really came up with a little motto in trying to sell it internally was, paper checks cost us dollars, ACH cost us pennies, and virtual cards gets us rebates. And when you start to throw some of that information and even put together some of the numbers, talking to the CFO and telling him, hey, we have an opportunity to turn this into an electronic process and get some rebate dollars back, it's kind of a chuckle saying, okay, well, who's going to do the recruiting and what vendors are really going to take a V card and have to, for you to allow you to get the rebate. So when we were able to explain, part of the process is the vendor enrollment team with SunGuard, and then explaining to him how the rebates worked and how we can really save money, and then actually the rebates will start covering a lot of our costs, it was a pretty easy sell for us.
Right. And Gary, in your experience, right, when people are trying to get a project off the ground, right, and there are the concerns about people, there's usually some security concerns, questioning about the ROI, or maybe the need for IT resources. Can you talk a little bit about strategically how somebody can go about overcoming these hurdles?
I think James and Marcel had pointed it out exactly. When you can turn a cost center or an accounts payable process into more of a profitable part of the organization, I think that speaks volumes to the return on investment. And then obviously partners like yourself that strategically can act as the liaison and take on some of the heavy lifting, whether that be integrating virtual payments into an existing enterprise system, the vendor enrollment process itself. So when folks at the top of the food chain that need to weigh in and make decisions for the organization that act in the best interest, we talk about being able to reallocate resources where accounts payable departments are challenged with having too few hands on deck, and being able to reassign those folks to more of a better use of their time, be able to automate a process, and then take a return on the investment, and whether that's a hard dollar opportunity in the form of rebate or whether that's a soft dollar cost efficiency or savings because of an automation of the process itself. I think now you're starting to talk about a process that makes a lot more sense to an organization and acts in its best interest, as well as the efficiencies that are gained because of it. Mm-hmm. So it all adds up to a really good story, and then when you couple that with partners like yourself that understand how to apply this to an organization, whether that's in the content and messaging that's sent out to the vendor community that you're trying to enroll, or the integration part, as long as the scales are not tipped too unfavorably on one side of the organization or the other, I think it's a win-win situation for most folks involved, and it's easily recognized.
Yep. So as I mentioned earlier, vendor enrollment is the key to the successful adoption of electronic payments by your suppliers, but our experience has shown that every single campaign is unique in its own way, either because of the messaging or the tone of the campaign or the pace of the campaign or the way the vendors are segmented. So we work with your vendors to integrate them into the program. We will email them, mail them, call them. It's a comprehensive program, and its strength lies in the fact that we have one team that can handle all payment types. And of course, the program isn't a one-time event. It's ongoing because you're always adding new vendors to your vendor master. So really, we're an extension of your AP staff, right? We manage changes to the banking information. We can answer questions with regards to remittance information. If it becomes a dispute, we can forward it to you. We also follow up on expiring cards, and we help vendors process their cards via their merchant terminals. We have a dedicated inbound support team for your vendors, which means for you a reduction in inbound calls to your AP department. And a top differentiator of working with SunGard is that we handle the enrollment activity for all vendors, not just the large ones. And we will collaborate with your company on messaging to your vendors that'll drive the adoption that you want. And we can certainly share with you our own best practices that resulted in our highest adoption rates, and then tailor that messaging to your unique vendor set. And part of this differentiation is based on how we together segment your vendors. We then execute on the campaign, and this is really where adoption is king, right? Because the partner who can drive the highest adoption rate is the partner you want to work with. And the reason behind this is that any potential rebate that you'll earn from a card program is driven by adoption, and adoption is hard. That's why we make 5 phone calls to a vendor before we put them back in a future follow-up campaign list. Our experience has shown that 41% of the vendors that we reach by phone will choose an electronic payment method, either ACH or card. But the hard part is just simply getting them on the phone in the first place. We talked earlier about researching to find the necessary contact data. We will do that on our customers' behalf. And in fact, after we gather that information, we're happy to share it back with you so that you can update your own vendor master files. And once we have them on the phone, we'll walk them through the registration process. They'll create a user account on our vendor portal. They'll provide banking information if it's for ACH. We verify that information. And then ultimately track the responses of the vendors and report back to you. Because like any endeavor, right, you need to measure it and be able to do some statistical analysis and follow up and have some quantifiable results to measure the success of the program. So James, maybe you can talk a little bit about how vendor enrollment worked with Win Wholesale and what your strategy was as you went to your supplier base with this message.
Yeah, the vendor enrollment piece was probably the biggest positive surprise for us. It was one of our biggest concerns going in, was someone else working with our vendors. We have a vendor list of about 48,000 vendors that we have in our vendor file, and we had targeted about 30,000 or so of them that we knew we wanted to turn into an electronic payment format. So really, the biggest thing was working with them on a strategy and making sure that the message was what we wanted it to be. So we worked real closely with the vendor enrollment team to get they gave us several different templates on how the language was slanted in the process for when they would contact a vendor. So that was the first piece, was making sure that they gave us a template and understanding here's the different types, and we wanted kind of a softer message to begin with this first group of vendors we were targeting that was more along the lines of, hey, please enroll, we're looking to move to this, not anything real forceful. So we kind of settled on that and then turned that information over to them, and it became a process, which is what was surprisingly positive for us. Was we set aside a time every 2 weeks where we would have a call with SunGard's vendor enrollment team, and we made sure that we hashed out anything that may have happened in the previous time. It was just a point in time that we could always look to for anything to kind of talk about our strategy. How is it working? Are we getting enrollment? Are we getting the feedback? How is that working? And then also, we didn't have a lot of the information for our vendors a lot of phone numbers or accurate information in our system. It just maybe had not been updated recently or for whatever reason. So I was concerned about that up front. But that's the other part that they added. The vendor enrollment team took what we gave them and kind of ran with it and found the information needed and would get a hold of the team members at the vendors' sites that were able to make the decisions. So really, to me, it was around setting that point in time of when we can always go back and talk about what worked and what didn't work, change our strategy as necessary, and then really getting that template down for how our message was going to be out to the vendors. And then just one side note, so as we got down to some of our vendors that were more service-oriented and we weren't going to impact discounts or terms, we went with a little bit of a stronger message saying, you know, we are going to require you to start accepting electronic payment. So we could be very flexible on that, and the vendor enrollment team picked that up and was able to really digest that, and we got the right message to the right vendors to try to get our adoption rate up.
Yeah, and I think that's a very valid point that as you segment the vendor list, right, you may have different messaging or a different tone of the campaign depending on which suppliers you're reaching out to. Yeah, our experience has been that our customers are probably going more comfortable going with a firmer message, maybe bordering on a mandate for those suppliers who are one-time suppliers or who are only paid, you know, maybe once or twice a year. Right, they're a little bit more comfortable saying, look, our electronic payment method of choice is virtual card, and this is the option that's being presented to you. Marcel, what was your strategy like as you rolled out your vendor enrollment program?
Well, we took a fairly soft-handed approach. As I had mentioned earlier, we had gone through a change in payment terms that was significant, and it wasn't that far back in the rearview mirror. We don't change vendors a lot. Most of our companies do not change them very often. And so we were going to an established group that had been through those changes in terms. And so we took a fairly soft approach to offering it without mandating it, but at the same time also not being very clear that there was an option. So we didn't say you have to do it, but we didn't express that there was a choice either. We went after the companies that would take credit cards in the normal course of their business. So cell phone companies, for example, they were able to pay their cell phone bills without having to, you know, really do anything special at all, just convert those payments over to virtual card. So we started there with those types of vendors, and then worked through the vendor database to see who in our database was already on PayNet Exchange and already taking cards for somebody else. And then we segregated out the large dollar vendors where our terms, you know, might be different, they may be negotiated, that sort of thing. So similar to what James was saying, we did take a slightly different approach with those guys, or in some cases remove them from the campaign entirely if we knew that it was a relationship that we wanted to keep as is. So we did do that. We did offer ACH when virtual card got any pushback from a vendor, but overall we did not, you know, verbally offer that up front unless somebody asked or pushed back about it. If they didn't take it up front, your team has gone out multiple times now on our vendor list and looked to sign up more and more vendors, and we have achieved more and more penetration as time has gone by. If we do get a new vendor, the goal is to try to take some virtual card payment up front without ever issuing them a check or an ACH. So as I mentioned, we don't have a lot of new vendors coming on board, but that's our approach when we do it.
Right. And Gary, from your perspective, what are some of the ways that you know, vendors can be incented or motivated to accept card?
I think there's a couple of ideas that come to mind. One is obviously educating that vendor or supplier that you're speaking with about the importance of sending enhanced or level 3 data across the system. You know, there are programs that MasterCard offers to help suppliers control the cost of acceptance. Obviously, the first is enhanced data and being able to process and transmit level 3 information, which in many cases is the invoice detail that they're carrying across in a manual process today. So that is one cost reduction measure. Another is obviously the large ticket program that MasterCard offers relevant to the transaction size, and that's tiered. Obviously, the rate is less than that we have set up for level 3 or level 2 transactions, mostly focused on purchasing and corporate cards. So the size of the transaction dictates the cost of interchange associated with it. But there are 3 tiers that focus on the size of that transaction to also help reduce the cost. One of the other methods that we've used in some of our campaigns is obviously shortening that days paid outstanding. And I think being able to address the DPO that exists in today's payment term with that vendor or supplier is critical. I think being able to shorten that and the cost reduction associated with shortening the number of days paid outstanding is a huge trigger for somebody that's not accepting today or that is reluctant to accept. So I think educating these vendors that there is more than just one way to accept a card, and then obviously offering them some incentives so that they don't bear too much of the burden themselves, and understanding that there's a positive gain for them if they can reduce the number of days paid.
Right, right. So from our perspective, the use of single-use virtual cards is the most rapidly growing area in the B2B payment space. But I'd like to do one last poll for our attendees. Is anybody using virtual cards in your payment processes today? We'll give folks a couple of seconds to respond here. And it looks like our poll has ended.
Hold on. Let's see. Ending in about 5 seconds. Hold on.
And yes, 43% are currently using them. Over half the people who responded are not using single-use virtual cards. We've got some folks who this is the right webinar for them because we're going to tell you about single-use virtual cards. So continuing ahead, interestingly enough, more than in a recent poll that was done by Ardent Partners, which is a respected analyst firm in the payment space, over half of the companies they talked to plan to increase their use of single-use virtual cards for making B2B payments. The flip side of that, and this is an interesting trend as well, is that buyers have indicated that they're more willing to choose a particular supplier if that supplier is willing to accept payment via a virtual card. And we're even seeing this show up as a line item in RFPs that are going out. So it's an interesting trend, and it just shows that the virtual cards as an alternative payment method are gaining traction. So what exactly is a single-use virtual card, right? Most of us are familiar with travel and expense cards, purchasing cards. One cards are really kind of a combination of T&E and P card, and it enabled companies that had both card programs to manage them with one card management platform. You may be using ghost cards, which are essentially a credit card but without any plastic, right? It's just a 16-digit number, and it's typically given to a particular supplier, and that supplier knows anytime they process an order, they're just going to charge that card. But the industry about 7 or 8 years ago came out with a new card product called a single-use virtual card, and the idea here is that a new card number would be issued for each and every invoice payment. And the credit limit on that card would be equal to the amount of the invoice or invoices being paid in that particular payment. But one of their big advantages was that they were single use, one and done. Once that card is authorized and settled, it can't be used again. And so it eliminated a lot of potential fraud, and it eased reconciliation because now you had one card for one payment and was very easy to match. And typically they're configured so that the card has to be authorized for the exact amount, which eliminated the recon problems caused by a vendor either overcharging the amount that was authorized or perhaps undercharging because they were applying a credit, thinking they were doing you a favor by applying the credit to the payment transaction, when in fact it actually created more work because now it didn't match and it was harder to recon. So they address a lot of the challenges that corporates experience when they tried to use things like a purchasing card or a ghost card for making large volumes of B2B payments. Now, single-use virtual cards do not eliminate purchasing cards or ghost cards. Each one of these commercial card products has its place and a situation where it's the right product for the particular use. But single-use virtual cards really lend themselves to automating the payment process and really now present an additional electronic payment settlement method for B2B payments. So it always leads to the next question, which is, well, why would a supplier say yes to cards, right? I mean, why would they pay the interchange on a card when they could get the ACH? Well, for a lot of merchants, the interchange is already included in your pricing, right? They're not really taking a hit on it because it's already factored into the pricing. We find for a lot of vendors, they value you as a customer. They don't want to lose you, and so to keep you as a happy customer, they're willing to accept a card. Gary had alluded to this. One of the incentives, one of the ways to incent a supplier to accept card is to change the payment terms. And some AP departments will do just that. We've also seen, though, that there are many AP departments that don't necessarily operate efficiently enough to really be able to offer earlier payment terms. What we see is the opposite. The payment terms may stay the same if the vendor will accept a card, but if they want to get paid by ACH or check, the payment terms are actually extended. So that's one of the ways that payers are incenting vendors. Another reason is they're already accepting cards today. There are a lot of businesses that run on a card, and any business that has an e-commerce presence or is taking telephone orders already knows how to handle a card not present transaction. And so they accept cards simply because you ask them if they would accept card. You may find that you're buying a commodity item from a number of different vendors, and being able to say to them, look, we'll concentrate more of our spend with you. If you are willing to accept a card, we'll grant you preferred supplier status. Is another way to incent them. And we talked about this earlier, where a full third of merchants that we talk to would rather accept a card than share their banking information because they're worried about security, and they perceive that their merchant account is more secure because they don't have to share their banking details. So as a quick illustration of what we're talking about and the potential for card rebates to really change the whole equation, if we took a company with 3,000 payments per month, 36,000 a year, and figure each check costs them $2.05. Why $2.05? Well, that's the lowest estimate we could find for the cost of a paper check. Depending on what analyst you talk to, the price per check can range anywhere from $2 up to $10 or more, but just to make the illustration a little bit more conservative, we're going to use a figure of $2.05. So 36,000 payments a year at $2.05 is a cost of $73,800 to make those payments. In this scenario where we might be able to migrate 50% of those payments to ACH, which will cost about 50 cents a piece, the total cost of the ACH plus the 18,000 ACH plus the 18,000 checks drops it to about a little under $46,000 per year. But in the case of card, where you might get 20% of your vendors to accept card, and the value per payment will vary depending on the size of your payments. on average, when we look at the average of all the tens of thousands of card payments that we do at SunGard, the average rebate for each payment is $12.50. That's where that came from for this illustration. So 20% of those payments at $12.50 means $90,000 a year in rebates, which is more than enough to cover the cost of printing checks and the cost of ACH. You know, in this scenario, we're looking at 50% ACH and 30% check and 20% card. Although in some of our more recent campaigns, we found the split to actually be quite a bit more favorable than that. We tend to average about 35% ACH and about 35% V-card. It's pretty evenly split. And then about 30% of the vendors want to stay on check. So, you know, these numbers would become even more favorable in that scenario. So back to our panelists for the last time. You know, what are some of the benefits that you've seen? Well, actually, Gary, let me start with you, and you know, maybe you can describe some of the benefits that you've seen corporates enjoy, not just from the rebate, but from in other areas as well, either in recon or automation or anything else that streamline their process.
Well, I think those are two chief components of why most folks move from the processes that they have previously, check, ACH, and wire, into a virtual card component is being able to automate that process and the cost efficiencies and operational efficiencies they see from that. Most folks are able to reallocate the resources, or the folks within the accounts payable department that are focused on that process, and be able to redirect them toward other processes that are perhaps more diligent for the organization. The reconciliation process itself and some of the tools that we have at our disposal today that allows for an easier reconciliation process throughout the payable streamline. So I think those proponents itself are most of the reason folks see. And then last but not least, always, it never hurts to receive a rebate back on what you're sending out. So whereby checks, ACH, and wire cost companies thousands of dollars to run each year, obviously the return on the card spend in the form of a rebate offered from many of the institutions that have cards in place today is second to none. So I think those values are why we see most folks moving in this direction.
Thank you. Thank you. And James, what were the benefits for Win Wholesale?
Just being able to really reduce the number of people involved in the payment process and paying our vendors was on the people side of it. Being able to reallocate them and push them to better, more proactive duties, and the ROI for the rebates for the V card has just completely exceeded our expectations. We were trying to get $1 million a year and spend through it just as we were slowly ramping it up, and that was about 18 months ago is when we started, and we were hoping in the first year to get $1 million for the year. And this past month, so just for the month of October, we ran $5.6 million through it. And I had mentioned we were targeting 30,000 vendors. It's still ongoing, and that was with only 3,300 of our vendors being enrolled. So wow. We were amazed at the number of vendors, or at the amount of dollars that came through it, and the rebates coming back and literally just paying for our accounts payable process and more has allowed us to really focus some of that rebate dollars on continuing to improve our process.
Right, right. And Marcel, what's your perspective on it?
Well, I think primarily we've actually found that we've gotten good feedback from our vendors that have signed up for virtual card. They're pleased with the additional information that they can get now and notifications they can receive and so on. So that was very important for us. For our business in particular, the labor savings has been significant. We are about 30% less labor required. So our AP, we have two AP folks have been able to redirect that labor elsewhere to more productive pursuits. And the rebates have far outstripped what we are paying for the remaining checks. The rebates we're on track for this year will they should turn our AP center into a profit center to cover about twice the cost of the salaries in that group. So even though we didn't eliminate an FTE, from our perspective, that's a benefit. With the reductions we've had, we don't want to pitch something that's going to eliminate positions particularly. Right. This allows people to expand in other directions, in their own careers. So, like to direct them towards strategic initiatives where they can serve the company better. So, we went from a structure that was costing thousands of dollars a month to print checks and run the AP department, and now it's costing us a few $100s to cut checks, and then we're getting these rebates back. In addition to that, our signers benefited from being able to now approve transactions while they're on the road, while they're remote, whatever the case might be. They don't have to be sitting in the office. They don't have to be at their desk to sign checks, and their AP staff doesn't need to run around trying to locate them so that they can do that. So overall, we benefited significantly, and our vendors are happy and have benefited as well. So it's been a great experience for us. Great.
Great. And it looks like we're at the end of our slides. It looks like we had a couple of questions that came in. Gary, I think I'll direct the first one at you. The question was, don't virtual cards have limited acceptance, meaning not all e-commerce merchants accept them?
I'm sorry, Matthew. Could you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, so the question was there's a concern that virtual cards have limited acceptance, that not all merchants can accept them.
Well, I guess it would depend on what format that virtual card is being sent, and obviously there's a few different styles, I guess, if you will, of the way that card information is transmitted. Mostly, we'd like to see that performed in the most secure manner possible, but I think that might be a little bit of folklore. I think many companies today that accept cards, have a procedure in place that enables them to accept a card in a virtual manner, and that virtual manner very generally refers to a card not being present. So whether that information is stored at the merchant location itself, whereby you're a regular buyer, so the existing agreement between buyer and supplier exists such that the card information is kept at the supplier, and hopefully that's being secured in the most appropriate way possible. Or, that information is transmitted in another fashion, perhaps through secure email, or perhaps in another manner, and sometimes we're not as privy to how those card numbers are being transmitted, and hopefully appropriately. But virtual, in many cases, what could be an email that's sent whereby some of those numbers are truncated out, and the information previous to the transaction itself is already being kept at the merchant location. Okay. And has been given to them previously.
Great, thanks. And I'll direct this next one to either Marcel or James. The question was, we often have to provide proof of payment, which is normally just a copy of a canceled check. How is this best handled with ePayments, especially ACH? So maybe you can talk about your internal procedures for providing a proof of payment.
Well, this is Marcel. Usually we would go on, if it's an ACH, we usually log on to our disbursement bank's website, and we'll pull the detail of that ACH with the banking information associated with it, and email that over to whoever needs to have it. But that's the proof from the bank directly that the funds were paid out and successfully sent.
Gotcha. Looks like that was it for our questions. I want to thank our panelists, Marcel, James, and Gary, for your participation today. We very much appreciate it. If you're interested, more information is available at our website, www.sungard.com/avantgarde, or feel free to email us at avantgardeinfo@sungard.com, and someone will get back to you. So thank you, everyone, for joining, and have a wonderful day.